Why does life seem to become smaller as we grow older? Not physically, psychologically. When we're young, the world feels impossibly open. We explore without overthinking. We imagine possibilities before limitations. Failure rarely convinces us to stop. We expect discovery. Then, almost without noticing, something begins to change. Disappointments accumulate. Responsibilities increase. The risks we once welcomed become the risks we learn to avoid. Gradually, our psychological world begins to shrink. Fear rarely announces itself. More often, it disguises itself as caution, as perfectionism, as the need to control every outcome, as endlessly rehearsing conversations that haven't happened. And perhaps most quietly of all, as holding on too tight. This is one of the great paradoxes of being human. The instinct designed to protect us can slowly imprison us. The tighter we cling to certainty, the smaller our world becomes. But what if that isn't the end of the story? What if the openness we associate with youth was never something we lost, but something buried beneath years of disappointment and self-protection? Today, we will explore that possibility through the work of three remarkable psychologists. William James helps us understand how hope quietly becomes attachment. Daniel Kahneman reveals how disappointment reshapes the way we perceive the world. And Csikszentmihalyi shows us how attention, curiosity, and presence can gradually restore the psychological freedom we thought we had left behind. Because perhaps the goal isn't to become fearless. Perhaps the goal is simply to stop allowing fear to decide the size of our world. Every meaningful journey begins in much the same way, with hope. Hope persuades us to apply for the job we may not get, begin a relationship, start a business, write a book, or pursue a dream no one else can yet see. Without hope, very little of value would ever be attempted. The problem begins when hope quietly becomes attachment. Not overnight, so gradually that we rarely notice it happening. I would love this opportunity becomes I need this opportunity. I hope this succeeds becomes this has to succeed. The goal is no longer something we're pursuing. It becomes something we're depending on. More than a century ago, William James observed that the things we care about gradually become woven into our sense of self. Our work, our relationships, our achievements, even our dreams. This is part of what gives life meaning, but it also leaves us vulnerable. When a goal becomes part of our identity, every setback feels more personal than it really is. A disappointing result no longer feels like an event, it feels like a verdict. This is what is called the White Knuckle Trap. Imagine trying to hold water in your hands. The tighter you squeeze, the faster it escapes. Psychologically, many of us do the same thing. The more desperately we try to secure one particular outcome, the more tension we bring into the very process that might have led us there. Instead of learning, we begin proving ourselves. Instead of exploring, we begin protecting ourselves. The goal hasn't changed, but our relationship to it has. Over time, disappointments accumulate. A rejection, a missed opportunity, a project that failed to gain momentum. Left unexamined, these experiences begin to shape how we see the future. We stop seeing individual setbacks. We start expecting another one. The world hasn't necessarily become less full of possibility, but our mind has become less able to recognize it. And when that happens, fear no longer simply influences our decisions. It begins to shape the size of our world. Which raises an important question. How does disappointment become powerful enough to reorganize our attention and change the way we see what's possible? To answer that, we need to turn to the work of Daniel Kahneman. Disappointment is part of every meaningful life. No career escapes setbacks. No relationship is free from heartache. No creative pursuit avoids criticism. Disappointment itself isn't the problem. The real question is what happens when disappointment becomes the lens through which we begin seeing the world. This is where the work of Daniel Kahneman becomes so illuminating. After decades of studying judgment and decision-making, Kahneman showed that the human mind is naturally more sensitive to loss than to gain. A painful experience leaves a deeper psychological imprint than a positive one. From an evolutionary perspective, this made sense. Missing a threat could be fatal. Missing an opportunity was usually less costly. That ancient instinct still shapes us today. Only now, the greatest threats are often psychological rather than physical. A failed business, a broken relationship, financial uncertainty, public criticism, unmet expectations. Gradually, these experiences stop feeling like isolated events. They begin to feel like evidence. Evidence that the world is becoming less safe. Evidence that disappointment is waiting around every corner. Without realizing it, our attention begins to change. We notice risk before possibility, problems before opportunities. We become more alert to what might go wrong than to what might go right. This is what is called the cycle of psychological narrowing. Hope gives rise to ambition. Ambition quietly becomes attachment. Attachment makes disappointment more painful. Disappointment narrows attention. A narrowed mind makes smaller, safer decisions. Those decisions often create further disappointment, and the cycle quietly repeats itself. The tragedy is that it feels as though we're becoming wiser. In reality, we're becoming smaller. You can see it everywhere. Someone stops applying for opportunities after a single rejection. An artist begins creating work for approval instead of expression. Different stories, the same psychology. The mind stops asking, "What's possible?" Instead, it asks, "How do I avoid being disappointed again?" That is the moment fear quietly becomes our guide. Not because we have become weaker, but because disappointment has reorganized our attention. The world hasn't necessarily become more dangerous. It only appears that way. And perception shapes behavior. Behavior shapes experience. Experience reinforces perception. The cycle feeds itself. But the moment we recognize the pattern, something changes. We create a small but powerful distance between ourselves and our fear. Awareness doesn't eliminate uncertainty, but it returns something just as valuable: choice. And perhaps that is where our psychological world begins to expand again. The question then becomes, how do we strengthen that expansion until curiosity becomes more powerful than fear? For that, we turn to the work of Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi. If fear has the power to shrink our psychological world, can it also expand again? The psychologist Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi spent much of his life searching for that answer. Rather than studying anxiety, he became fascinated by something else. He wanted to understand why certain moments make us feel completely alive. Artists disappeared into a painting. Musicians lost track of time. Athletes became absorbed in the next movement. Scientists vanished into their work. They weren't thinking about success. They weren't worrying about failure. They were simply immersed in what was directly in front of them. Csikszentmihalyi called this state flow. What fascinated him wasn't only that people performed better, it was that, for a while, their psychological world expanded. Attention returned to the present. Curiosity replaced self-consciousness. Fear lost its grip. Perhaps that reveals something important. Fear isn't overcome by trying to eliminate it. It gradually loses its influence whenever our attention becomes fully engaged with something meaningful. Think about the difference. The contracted mind asks, "What if I fail?" The expanded mind asks, "What deserves my attention right now?" The contracted mind searches for certainty. The expanded mind searches for understanding. The contracted mind protects what it already knows. The expanded mind remains curious enough to discover something new. Curiosity may be one of the most underestimated psychological forces we possess. Fear narrows our attention. Curiosity widens it. Fear asks us to protect ourselves. Curiosity invites us to participate in life again. This doesn't mean uncertainty disappears. The difficult conversations still need to happen. The business still faces challenges. The relationship still requires effort. Life itself doesn't become easier, but something within us begins to change. Instead of carrying yesterday's disappointments into today, we become present enough to meet this moment on its own terms. The mind stops trying to control every possible outcome. It starts paying attention again. And attention is where freedom quietly begins. Not because attention guarantees success, but because it returns us to the only place where meaningful action has ever been possible: the present moment. Perhaps this is what psychological expansion really means. Not becoming fearless, not becoming endlessly optimistic, but gradually recovering the openness that fear convinced us we had lost. The openness to learn. The openness to begin again. The openness to create without demanding certainty. The openness to trust that our worth is larger than any single outcome. Because every meaningful life includes uncertainty. Every meaningful life includes disappointment. But not every life has to become smaller because of them. The more deeply we engage with what is before us, the less tightly we need to hold on to what lies ahead. And perhaps that's the quiet paradox we've been searching for all along. The way forward isn't found by gripping life more tightly. It's found by becoming present enough to let life become larger again. Perhaps life doesn't become smaller because we grow older. Perhaps it becomes smaller because, little by little, we stop trusting ourselves to meet uncertainty. That is how fear quietly shrinks our world. But as we've discovered, this isn't where the story has to end. William James showed us how hope can quietly become attachment until our identity becomes entangled with outcomes we can never fully control. Daniel Kahneman revealed how disappointment reshapes perception, narrowing our attention until fear begins deciding what we notice and what we avoid. Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi reminded us that our world expands again whenever we become fully engaged with the present, when curiosity becomes more important than certainty. Perhaps freedom was never about eliminating fear. Fear is part of being human. Perhaps freedom is learning that fear doesn't have to become the architect of our lives. Because every meaningful life includes uncertainty. Every meaningful life includes disappointment. Every meaningful life invites us to begin again. The question isn't whether fear will visit us. The question is whether we'll allow it to decide the size of our world. So hold on to your dreams. Work hard. Care deeply. Love generously. Build something meaningful. But never hold on so tightly that fear becomes larger than your life. Instead, let your life become larger than your fear.